What is the difference between a philosophical politeia, a philosophical city-state, a constitution of a politeia, against the modern state and the form of governance as we know it today? The philosophical politeia would recognize the following in depth. Where does one person's freedom begin and end? And what are the limits of freedom between human beings? Aristippus, who was the founder of the Cyrenaic school, means something much deeper than simple independence here. The philosopher does not regulate his life based on external laws, but based on the harmony of his internal measure. If the laws of a state are abolished, the philosopher does not change the way he lives his life, because his true law is within him. The phrase Homoeios viosomεν does not mean we will live the same or with equality, but we will live in a similar way, meaning similarity regarding the understanding of our essence. And this not through external identifications, or what we think, or what we believe, or what we even feel emotionally. Homoeios is the one who shares common or related characteristics with another, is the one who participates in the same kind of order, not the same form. To bring an example that's more political, but it's a very good example to understand the meaning of the word homoeios. In ancient Sparta, the term homii was the official name for the full citizens of Sparta, the Spartiates. The choice of this word was deeply ideological and political. The Spartans did not call themselves equal in the sense of absolute, complete equality in every aspect. The term homii emphasized that all full citizens were similar regarding certain decisive aspects that defined their stand in the politeia. And these aspects were their Dorian ancestry, their agogoi, which was the education of Sparta, the education of the Polis, and their upbringing, which molded their character, their ethos, their way of life, and also their participation in the communal syssitia, the common meals, and the complete dedication to military life. And also the possession of full political rights, participation in the appella, which was the assembly of the people, and also their economic basis, the possession of a kleros, which means allotment, a lot of land that allowed them to contribute to the syssitia and live their military and political life. So in this example, to explain the meaning of the word in Sparta, the homoiotis, the similarity, is political. The homii are similar in respect to the common agogoi, the common way of life, the shared logos of the Spartan politeia. The law of Lycurgus's Ritra was homogeneous and concerned the formation of the common ethos, which means the common character and internal order of the citizens. In Aristippus's or Plato's philosophical meaning, the homii means that the philosopher lives homoeios, not because of an external law, because an external law imposes it, but because he has achieved the internal agogoi and the harmonia of the logos, of the internal law. So the Spartan term shows that homoiotis, similarity, is always a related order concerning a common essence or principle, a logos, whether this is the agogoi of Sparta or the harmony of the philosopher's soul. Therefore, homoeios means we will live according to the same internal order, the same principle of law, our nature, just as the Spartans lived according to their to the shared agoi and common way of life. The contrast, external coercion versus internal order. Modern governance, the so-called modern state, is a system of external coercion. It functions through laws that are imposed to regulate the imbalance of the instincts and desires, firstly because the majority of people are not capable of being governed by themselves, and second because if the majority of people were capable of being governed by themselves, then the very structures of power would crack and collapse. So the philosophical Politeia, as Plato or Aristippus would have understood it, is the order of the formed soul that is then reflected in society itself. And there, the laws are no longer commands, but it's a reflection of the very nature of being. Justice in a philosophical Politeia is something that is cultivated from a young age. It is not imposed, but it is expressed. The freedom of one does not conflict with the freedom of the other because it presupposes the knowledge of the self's essence and the knowledge of how human psychosynthesis works and how virtues like Enkrateia, which is self-control, Ataraxia, which is tranquility, Sophrosyne, which is prudence, are achieved. All these things are recipes, and every school of philosophy was a series of methods for achieving Eudaimonia. To put it simple, it kind of means flourishing and also spiritual freedom. That's what Eudaimonia means. A school of thought might work for one person, but not for another. For example, I am more of a Pythagorean and Platonic, but I have a very good friend of mine who is more Epicurean. And what happens in the end? We might have different views, but at the same time, we fully understand each other 100%. This is the power of true philosophy. In a philosophical Politeia, freedom is not a right, but a heightened consciousness. The limit of one's freedom is the measure of the other one's awareness. And where consciousness ceases to exist, then the need for external law begins. That is why the philosopher does not need external restrictions. His internal law, his understanding of the common logos, of the cosmic logos, is his limit. And then he lives homoeios because his orderliness does not depend on imposition. It depends on his own self-regulation. Politeia on the individual level is having the city, the polis within you, meaning having the correct relationship between the parts of your soul and your mind. Thus, ethos, which is character and disposition, precedes law. So the essence is not if laws exist, but who needs them. When people have not yet become citizens of their own soul, they need laws to restrain them. But when a person becomes a philosopher, the law, with a capital L, not the law of, for example, the modern state institutions and laws, the law with a capital L becomes his nature, and then his Politeia is ensouled. It is something that it's animated, it is not institutional. The words polis and Politeia share the same roots as polarity, polarization. Pola in Greek means many. So it is the perfect position between the one and the many. And there is a common thread that unites everything. There's a common thread that unites all numbers, and this common thread is the monad. Gurdjieff, Dionysus, and the unification of the psyche. Gurdjieff, by saying that man is a legion, using the biblical reference to demons in the Christian sense, not the Greek, since the Greek is the exact opposite. It corresponds to man finding the common element within multiplicity, confirms the Greek observation of division and the fragmentation in the human psyche. The multiplicity, the many. The legion consists of the many contradictory and autonomous sub-personalities, the many I's or prosopia, personas, to use a Jungian terminology, that dominate modern man. Man lives what has been mythologically expressed by the dismemberment of Dionysus by the Titans. He lives as a collection of unconnected reactions, instincts, and desires without any central will whatsoever. And this corresponds to the state of confusion and multiplicity within the perceptible world, within the world of the senses. The One. Gurdjieff's teaching, the Fourth Way, aims at the achievement of a true unified self, a central ego that will unify the divided parts of the soul and body, so that Dionysus then can be reassembled, can be resurrected. Now, similarities to later traditions are probably accidental, with the difference that later traditions focus on some external him, distracting man from truly seeing what is happening inside him and turning outwards, somewhere else, to some other. The state of true existence of being is the return to the One, to the true unified essence of the human, which is in absolute harmony with everything around him. This is the cosmos. This is the cosmic man. Cosmos comes from the verb kosmeo kosmo, which means to adorn, to arrange, to put in order, to honor something. And there's an expression, kosmeo eαυτόν, which is I arrange myself, I govern, I administer myself, I manage myself. It is funny because modern Greek parents would say to their kids, be Cosmios, and they mean behave yourself, but they do not actually know anymore the actual etymology of the word, most parents at least. So we use it in our everyday language, but most people don't know where it comes from. So this exact need for internal unity is a prerequisite for true consciousness and freedom. So the goal, whether in Plato, Pythagoras, Heraclitus, Epicurus, or even in more psychological terms like Gurdjieff and Carl Jung, is the unification of the many, our sensory inputs, our ego feelings, so to speak, under the guidance of the One, of the idea, of the logos, of the central ego. Harmony and the limit of the good and beautiful. Aristotle, in the Nicomachean Ethics, mentions that the Pythagoreans said that evil is infinite, apeiron, it's called in Greek, while the good and kalos, which is beauty, that's where we get the word calligraphy, are peras, which means a limit, a boundary. Kakon, in Kratilos, Socrates says that the word kakon is from kakos ion, which means something that has a destructive orbit, a destructive motion. So, evil, arises within multiplicity and division, while kalos and the good are located in an absolutely specific mathematical position that is approached only through harmony. The word harmonia, which is harmony, comes from the verb armozo, which is to join and connect, to fit. And the word armos means a join and a gap. It's a joint between two different building blocks. So the very etymology of harmonia implies the idea of connection, of fitting together, and of correct proportion. Armos is the point where two or more surfaces meet. So it's the gap, the opening created between two different surfaces that have been joined together. The gap in this sense is the nous. Nous means mind, higher mind. It is what is hidden behind the noise of uncontrolled thoughts, of desires, emotions. The armos, the silent space. Armos is the joint or gap where things fit, and this is where we get harmonia from. Its philosophical meaning, the armos, is the nous, is the mind or conscience realized without the noise of desires, of emotions, or any external programs. Ancient Greek philosophy meets Buddhism and yoga, samadhi and nirvana in this space of pure silent consciousness. This quiet, non-discursive state of the nous is the exact goal of Ataraxia, which is tranquility, and mirrors the Eastern practices of samadhi or vipassana, where the mind's noise is stilled to achieve pure awareness. This is the meeting point of Plato's nous and the Eastern quest of Hinduism and Buddhism for moksha. It's the moment the soul achieves its perfect internal symphonia. The Western tradition often missed this contemplative core. The reason this profound connection, the meditative internal aspect, was often missed in Western Europe stems from historical and philosophical shifts. 1. The rise of Scholasticism and Rationalism. As European thought evolved, especially post-Renaissance and during the Enlightenment eras, there was a strong emphasis on logos as reason, logic, and dialectic as a discursive thought, prioritizing the logistikon part of the soul as a calculating external and objective faculty. The nous as intuitive, direct, and mystical apprehension was marginalized. 2. The church-state model. The focus shifted to systems of external law, either the church or the state, and to sin or obedience, making the concept of an individual's complete internal nomos less necessary or even subversive. The necessity for external restraint, which is Procrustean Bed, we will analyze it at the end of the video, became the default assumption about human nature. 3. Loss of Paideia as vios, a way of life. The philosophical schools, the Platonic Academia, the Lycion, the Kippos, were originally centers of life, of Paideia, and of spiritual exercise. In the West, philosophy became primarily a subject of study of abstract theory rather than a way of living, a vios, thereby losing the practical meditative core that links it to the Eastern practices. And naturally, harmony is also connected to the verb ararisko. Ararisko means to join, to fit, as well as to arithmos, which means number, artios, which means even and perfect, areti, which is virtue, aristos, which means best, and perhaps Aris, which is Mars, the god of war. And why war? Because the war between opposites, of duality. Because, as Plato says, to conquer yourself is the brightest of all battles. But how many people achieve this victory? Very few. The Greeks had a very different conception of what we call music today. Music comes from the verb mao, which means to devise, to seek, or to pursue something spiritually, and is connected to spiritual search and invention. If you think what music is geometry in motion. Everything that moves, in the process of moving, it produces harmony. It is motion in order, and is subject to specific rules in order for this order to be produced. Otherwise, we have disorder, we have chaos. So, just as the composer is called from the many notes, the rests, the tonalities, the scales, the intervals, the various rhythms, to produce something that will have coherence so that we can call it a composition, so too a human being is called to reach such a point of perception that he can bring himself into order. Correspondence of musical harmony rules to psychosynthesis. Essentially, music functions as a model of the universe and the very psyche. So harmony is achieved when the many, the notes, the intervals, the parts of the soul are subjected to the common logos, which is the one, the rhythm, and the internal law. How man becomes the absolute composition, a symphony. Man becomes the absolute composition, a symphony, when he achieves the unification of his divided parts, the legion or the dismembered Dionysus. And this happens under the guidance of the Logos. The process corresponds exactly to the process the composer follows to transform the chaos of all the isolated sounds into a cosmos, into an order, into an adornment. So the first struggle is the internal struggle. It's the victory of the internal Aries. It's Plato's brightest battle. The human being must first recognize that he or she is a legion, many egos, many different personas, and not one, which is one central we. Then we have the application of the verb mao, which is the search for the spiritual essence and internal measure. And this search requires self-awareness, self-observation, and consciousness, development of consciousness. The Logos which is the rational part of the soul, must gain control and harmonize the other parts of the soul, which is the spirited part and the appetitive part, so that they start acting in cooperation, not in conflict. The establishment of the internal law, Harmonia. When this unification is achieved, man becomes Cosmios, orderly. And there we have symphony. The soul reaches a state where all its parts sound together harmoniously. Symphoneo. It's symphony. Phony comes from light, phos, and nous. At this point, moral action now springs naturally, without internal conflict or the need of any external coercion. So, as the Pythagoreans said, the good and the beautiful, the kalos are peras, they have limit, definition, perfect form. The symphony is precisely this perfection that emerges from the submission of the infinite multiplicity to specific mathematical proportions, and then we have harmony. And the man has acquired the Politeia within him, the correct relationship between the parts of the soul. His internal logos, his internal law, is now his nature, confirming Aristippus' saying that if the laws were abolished, we would be living Homoeios, because his order is ensouled, not institutional. So the symphonic man, therefore, the one who applies the rules of cosmic geometry, the logos, to his own psychosynthesis, he is actually transforming himself from chaos to cosmos. The letter lambda as the geometry of logos and unification. So the analysis of the letter lambda, as I will now explain it, which I have not seen it anywhere, but I imagined it, but it is a very nice symbol of the path from the many to the one, and it's extremely Pythagorean and Platonic. The two lower ends of the letter are the many, it's duality. From the two, we get to three, and then we get the many. So they symbolize the multiplicity of phenomena, the conflicting forces of the soul, Gurdjieff's legion, and the external world of the senses, of social programmings, and of our own confusions, passions, etc. This is the very state of human division. Now, the convergence at the apex is the one, it's unity. And it symbolizes the understanding of the logos. It's the central balanced ego, the essence. And the metron, which means measure, how we say metronome, that is achieved through the knowledge of the whole. The knowledge of the whole and the knowledge of both legs of the letter, from the bottom to the top. It is the point where the two lower legs, the complexity converges into a common principle. And the process for this to happen is the process of dialectic, which is the process of having a true, honest dialogue with yourself. So the very path from the base to the apex is the path of dialectic and of purification, which is catharsis in Greek, filtering what you want to keep and what you want to get rid of. And this is the path of the musician. It's the process of philosophy as an agogí, as a conduct, as a guidance, as paideia, which means education in Greek, but it's formation. And what does a doctor give us? A doctor gives us agogí, a treatment, a guidance to cure us. So, with a continuous internal question, what is truly mine, a human being starts separating his essence from all the external admixtures, the programmings, the traumas, and all the social software that is installed from childhood. The myth of Procrustes, the social mutilating power. The story of Procrustes and Theseus is one of the labors that Theseus had to complete on his journey from Tryzina to Athens to prove his worth, similar to what Hercules did. Procrustes, whose name literally means he who stretches by force, from cruo, which means to strike, to beat, to hit hard. He was a famous robber in the area of Elefsina. Procrustes trapped the travelers by offering them hospitality and a nice bed to sleep in. His bed was quite peculiar. If the guest was shorter than the bed, Procrustes would stretch and pull him to reach the bed's length. If the guest was longer than the bed, Procrustes would cut off his limbs, his feet, his hands, his head, to fit exactly. In this way, no one ever naturally fit the bed, which symbolized a very rigid, murderous even, destructive model of homogenizing human consciousness imposed by an evil, predatory authority. The bed and sleep naturally symbolize exactly this spiritual sleep, the unconsciousness, the trap into which most people fall, never reaching self-knowledge. And the fact that Procrustes was living on Iera Odos, which means the sacred way, the holy avenue to Elefsis, where the Elefsinian mysteries were held, is of course highly symbolic. His location represented an entity blocking people from achieving a higher consciousness, their fulfillment, and the sacred knowledge of life and death that he was taught in the mysteries. The confrontation by Theseus. Theseus, traveling to meet his father, King Aegeus, confronted Procrustes. Theseus accepted the robber's invitation, and when Procrustes attempted to carry out his ritual, Theseus immobilized him and forced him to lie down on his own bed. And Procrustes, being a huge guy, did not fit his own bed. So Theseus defeated Procrustes, the robber who forced travelers to fit his bed by stretching or cutting off their limbs, by applying the same punishment to the robber himself, pay him back his own coin. By defeating Procrustes, Theseus liberated the area from fear and secured a safe passage on the road to Athens. Athens here is symbolic for wisdom. In Greek mythology, Procrustes was also called Damastes, which again comes from the verb damazo, and it means to subdue, to tame, to conquer, to dominate, for example, wild animals, or in this case, consciousness. Consciousness that has not achieved self-knowledge. So, tamed by imposing control and authority. So it's the nature of a ruler who imposes his own one-dimensional standard to human beings. Procrustes was also the father of Sinis, the pine bender, Pitiokamtis in ancient Greek. Another robber whose name means the destructive one, from sino. Sino means to destroy. The English word sin is related to this root. The etymology of the name Theseus is not fully established, but it is probably connected to the word thesis, which is thesis or thesis, depending on the dialect. Could be thesis, could be thesis, different Greek dialects. And the verb tithemi, which means to place, to set. Some sources I have read that they suggest the name might come from the word thesaurus, thesavros, which means treasure, or the word theo, which is theo, to run, to accelerate, and the word ethos, which is year, time, suggesting that the name could mean he who runs to find treasures, or he who crosses time. From all these different theories, we can definitely conclude that the name of Theseus, whether it comes from thesis, thesaurus, or theo, indicates his actions and achievements. So the treasure here is none other than heightened consciousness, which forms what we call the path of Hercules, the path of the hero. Philosophical significance of the Procrustes myth. Procrustes is the one who shapes, strikes reality or a human being by force, so that it is extended, stretched, and adapted to predetermined, rigid framework. The bed is the system, is an external authority, an external law. So the myth of Procrustes, in the operation of the modern state and the modern nature of governance, is a very powerful critique about homogenization. The system of power in the modern state operates as Procrustes, who has a fixed framework, the framework of law, of obedience, of consumer, of voter, and this framework is rigid and indifferent to the individual nature of a human being. So, instead of the framework adapting to the unique nature of a human being, as in the philosophical Politeia, where law is a reflection of the very nature of things and the very nature of every individual, the state mutilates or deforms the human being to fit the predetermined socio-political model. So if a person exceeds, has independent thought, internal law, they are mutilated, restricted, controlled, or marginalized. If a person falls short, is without will, a passive recipient, they are deformed, stretched, and injected then with artificial needs, with fears and desires. So the purpose of Procrustes here, of external authority, is to maintain multiplicity and imbalance in man, so that he requires an external law and coercion to function. The philosopher as unity. So the philosopher, the man of harmonia and symphonia, which is harmony and symphony, is the one who rejects the Procrustean bed. And what has he achieved? He has unified his divided parts, the lambda at the apex. He has separated his true logos from all the external programming. And in this way, the philosopher is self-governed and lives homoeios, not because he follows external laws, but because his internal law is the precise geometric harmony that the system itself is trying to destroy and control and to subdue. So this is why so many people today suffer from depression and are unhappy, nervous, and psychologically burdened, because civilization itself has mutilated them to fit into the bed, having first managed to appease them and put them to sleep since their childhood. Thank you very much. Bye.